Hello, and welcome to what is hopefully going to turn out to be an on-time episode of Zilog and Moto, after the repro manual shenanigans that I had to deal with last week. My name is Dave, and Zilog and Moto is my YouTube channel, consisting of deep dive looks into every English language title for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can play it using a Sega Genesis via some sort of adapter and be able to read what's on the screen, no matter where it was originally sold, I'm trying to collect a complete copy of it and then play and review the title, inside and out, for this channel. Now, admittedly, when you're trying to review the bulk of the games that came out for multiple consoles, there's going to be some games that are pretty interesting to look at. Perhaps things that are somewhat obscure and that people aren't familiar with, which is honestly something that grows every day as the generations of kids that grew up with these consoles continues to age out. And then there's some titles that, regardless of whether the people are familiar with them or not, they just probably aren't going to be that noteworthy. Case in point of this is the difference between the last episode of Zilog and Moto versus this one. Last week, the subject of the review was Task Force Harrier EX, a port of an already somewhat obscure vertical shooter from the 1989 arcade scene, and thankfully, it turned out to be a pretty great game and experience. Unfortunately, with a catalog with about 1,280 titles that I'm looking into, some of these titles just aren't going to be that exciting, at least on the surface, which is where we've ended up today with this week's game. Now, before this review turns into absolute doom and gloom, I want to be clear about a few things. First off, sports games are not inherently bad. I think there's a lot of people out there that have the opinion that the Genesis is an inferior console because it had a lot of sports titles, which I think is a bit of a flawed take. I mean, sure, there are a lot of sports titles for the Genesis, but that doesn't mean that it didn't have games that were of value. And some of these sports games and series that spent a good deal of their infancy on the Genesis have ended up being games that have continued to have been played by multiple generations of kids onto current consoles. So I just caution people to not look at a random sports title on the Genesis and think, that's just a crappy sports title. You can tell because it's not worth anything. When chances are, it's probably at least a half-decent title, especially if you like that sport. Now, granted, if you hate football, John Madden or Joe Montana probably aren't going to convert you, but that's a different conversation. This all brings us back to today's game, and that is RBI Baseball 93 for the Genesis and only the Genesis, as RBI Baseball 93 was not released anywhere besides North America after the previous game in the series, RBI Baseball 4, had been released in Japan and Korea. Now, a baseball game not getting a release in Europe isn't exactly surprising, but being dropped from Asia after the previous release is a little more concerning. I've reviewed the previous two games in the series, RBI Baseball 3 and 4, previously in episodes 5 and 104 specifically, and in both of those cases, the game was fine. Neither edition specifically impressed me, but if you wanted just a solid, simple baseball title, they both got the job done. But there was clearly room for improvement. Now, will RBI Baseball 93 finally be the game to get the job done? Or is it just more of the same generic action that hasn't changed much from its roots on the NES? We shall see, but first a look at the package.
Okay, so no goofiness this week with having to obtain multiple copies of the game, just this copy of RBI Baseball 93 that I've had for a pretty long time, I think. It's a pretty common release, so it wasn't hard to find when I started collecting, and even today it's not very valuable, with complete copies like this one going for about $10. I don't think I realized at first that RBI Baseball got 4 different releases on the Genesis, so I might have been missing 1 or 2 of them for a while just because I didn't know they existed, but it didn't take too long to correct that. This particular copy is in pretty good shape, with no real markings to the outside of the case, minus the hang tab being removed at the top, and the inner cover is fully intact as well, with no edge wear or water damage. But if you flip over to the spine, there does appear to be some weird sun bleaching, so perhaps this sat on a shelf for a few years or something, but it's not bad enough to where I feel like I need to pick up another copy. As far as the cover art goes, I like it. The entire cover, wrapping around to the rear, has the same background of grass from a baseball field, And while the Tengen crossbar formatting is used on the front, they were clever enough with the design to have a baseball rocketing across the front and shattering the crossbar, not unlike a poor unsuspecting car windshield in the parking lot outside of the field. No, that never happened to me, and I certainly wasn't the batter who fouled the ball off into my teammate's car. Why do you ask? Along with that, there's the RBI Baseball logo at the top, largely unchanged from the two previous editions of the game, just with the numbering changed, and down below is the MLBPA logo, letting you know that the game will feature real players' names as it had in the past. Flipping over the back, and boy, this is a bit of a mess, as it looks like a kid who had their baseball card collection strewn all over the floor, combined with screenshots from the game. I don't mind it though. I've got to give them credit for an original layout, especially compared to earlier Tengen releases, and the screenshots are all of excellent quality, even if the screenshots are depicting doesn't exactly appear to be the most exciting. And in a nice touch, all of the pictures of the players on the rear cover are specifically related to the screenshots that are shown, as the flavor text points out. Except for Barry Bonds down in the corner for some reason. That poor guy, he just can't catch a break, I guess. Opening up the package, and the inside looks fantastic, with both the manual and the cartridge being in near mint condition, and the original warranty reply card is still intact as well. Looking at that warranty card, I like how the SNES has a space between the S and the NES, not once but twice. I don't think I've ever seen that anywhere before, but also it's got a checkbox at the top in case the card was for a TurboGrafx release. You know, I guess in case you bought the one Tengen release for the TurboGrafx, Clax, back in 1990, 3 years before RBI Baseball 93 came out. As far as the manual goes, it's got a nice page design. I like the pinstripes and the baseball-related headers and footers, and it fully explains the game with the occasional screenshot. And then the second half of the manual is dedicated to providing rosters for all of the teams included in the game, including the All-Star and Playoff teams. This is a nice reference, and I'm glad they included it, so you'd know who's on what team without having to try to look it up in the game. And the accurate stats of the players from the 1992 season is a nice bonus. Okay, that's the package. Let's play some ball. These days, when discussing yearly releases of sports titles, a lot of the time one of the primary questions about said title is, what has changed? And the worst examples, usually centering around the FIFA series, but in other series as well, the answer is nothing. Well, that's not exactly true. In these types of games, usually the selling point is having rosters for the teams be updated so that they are accurately reflecting the teams that are actually playing on the field in real life, or at least a version of them has been updated in the last 12 months or so. But frequently, other than that, the rest of the game has changed very little, to the point to where it's entirely possible that offhand, if you were to see two different versions of a game running right next to one another, unless you saw an obvious marker of which game you were playing, like say the title screen, it would be nearly impossible to tell due to the games looking so alike and running on the same or possibly a slightly modified graphics engine. However, in the early 90s, usually it was a little more common for there to be some major differences in the sports games from year to year, just due to how early it was in the lifespan for some of these game series. Sure, you might have multiple games in a series that still look the same at first glance, but once you actually start examining the game, you probably would see some major differences, such as the list of included teams, possibly the addition of battery backup and/or stat tracking, custom rosters, season mode, and maybe even custom players, as there was still some very real competition to try to release the best sports games of that genre. Well, I did say usually, which means that there's some exceptions to that rule, and unfortunately, it looks like we've stumbled into a big ol' exception this week. Between RBI Baseball 3 and RBI Baseball 4, there were some definite differences between the two titles, and while they might not have been huge, it was at least easy to tell some of the things that had changed between the two titles. For instance, the pitching-batter interface, something that you probably are going to spend a majority of the time looking at when playing the game, was overhauled to attempt to get the game away from its NES roots. And the game even got the addition of some custom stadiums to try to add some big league feel to the game, even if it was still missing proper MLB licensing. Not to mention the addition of some new game modes aside from the standard one-on-one exhibition mode and best of 7 series mode. The difference between RBI Baseball 4 and RBI Baseball 93, however, well, honestly, at first glance, I'm really struggling to find any differences. First off, I'm pretty certain that there's no graphical changes between the games, aside from perhaps the title and menu screens, and one other slight addition that I'll mention in a minute. The batter pitcher interface and the stadium's views are identical to what was present in RBI Baseball 4, down to the occasional animations that play in the first and third base windows when you're at bat, and the custom stadiums that were added in RBI Baseball 4. I did some direct A/B comparisons between the two games, freezing the game in similar situations, and there's just not a notable difference during the in-game action. Even the scoreboard that's displayed between innings and the player substitutions seems to appear to be exactly the same, with perhaps just some very, very small details that I didn't notice. Along with the graphics, the sound doesn't appear to have changed either. Perhaps there's a few additional music tracks or maybe some new sound effects, but the digital speech used in game is 100% unchanged. And while I can certainly understand the reuse of sound effects or brief organ themes in the game, even the great Yuzo Koshiro was known to reuse an effect or two between games, this just appears to be incredibly lazy, and it's not like the speech used was great to begin with. On the contrary, it's a bit rough. But more on that later in the review. So, okay, the graphics and sound seem to be a cut and paste job from the previous game. Maybe perhaps Tengen put some effort into improving the game modes available to the player. Yeah, no. And in fact, not even a sarcastic no, but actually not at all. The game features the exact same gameplay modes from RBI Baseball 4. For RBI Baseball 4, there were 2 expanded game modes added to the game. The ability to take on either all teams from your division or all teams period, with password save functionality, and the new Game Breakers mode, which added in 17 new scenarios to the game, where you would pick your team and your opponent, and then you would play a game where it was already in progress, with either you having to slam the door on your opponent and close the game out, or come from behind to win the game. RBI Baseball 93 includes both of these game modes, completely unaltered. And even worse, the good old password save system is still included, because including battery backup would make far too much sense, and be seen as an actual improvement between the two games, even if nothing else was changed. And of course, with no battery backup, that means that other things that the players might want in a baseball game, like perhaps a full season mode, or gasp, stat tracking beyond the current game, is excluded. Because out of all the major sports, baseball fans are the least likely to care about statistics, right? And did Tengen really think that no one would notice that the Game Breakers mode was completely untouched? I mean, 17 is a pretty odd number, so it sticks out quite a bit for RBI Baseball 93 to just happen to have the same amount of Game Breakers variations from the previous title. And I get that there's only so many different situations that teams could find themselves in at the end of a game, but you could have added just a few more to make it a little less obvious, or add the ability to have custom scenarios, or maybe even perhaps have them based on real-life events. Nah, that's just crazy talk. I mean, I suppose who would even put that in a game? I've been pretty hard on RBI Baseball 93 so far for being just a complete rehash of the previous year's game, and I think for good reason. As far as I can tell, the only difference between the two games is that RBI Baseball 93 got updated rosters to correspond to the 1992 MLB season, and along with having those rosters updated, what's probably the game's biggest selling point is the addition of the 2 new for 1993 MLB season expansion teams, the Florida Marlins and the Colorado Rockies, which at the time were the MLB's first expansion team since 1997, when the Toronto Blue Jays and the Seattle Mariners joined the American League. I remember being in 8th grade when this expansion happened, and there was definitely a lot of buzz around these two teams, especially with their colorful new uniforms that stood out amongst the rest of Major League Baseball. So I could see Tengen thinking that they needed to get a new game out as soon as possible to take advantage of the expansion, and perhaps that's why the game is in the state that it is. And to that point, if you check the build dates of the two titles, they're only 7 months apart, with RBI Baseball 4 apparently being completed in June of 1992, and RBI Baseball 93 being completed in January of 1993, even though it wasn't released until the following summer, as RBI Baseball 4 had just come out in September of 1992. And honestly, while it's clear that it was rushed into production with minimal work based on those dates, The fact that the game was done in January but not released until June, 5 months later, make things even worse for Tengen, because clearly they had time to tweak and update the game before they released it, but chose to do nothing in that 5 months instead. If you happen to watch episode 104, or are already familiar with RBI Baseball 4, then you can probably skip this next section, as you already know what to expect from the game. But just in case you're not, or if you want a refresher, I'll go over a review of the game's contents briefly. RBI Baseball 93 is an arcade-style baseball game that features representations of all 28 current, for the 1993 season, MLB teams, all 4 division champions from the 1984 through the 1991 seasons for another 32 teams, and finally, National and American League All-Star teams from 1989 through 1992. The only hitch to including all these teams is that due to licensing restrictions, only current players will have their proper names in the game, and the game only features a MLB Players Association license and not a MLB license, which means that there are no team names or logos in the game. Not having the MLB license isn't the end of the world, as Tengen did give all the teams their proper colors and created custom stadiums to represent the Fenways and Wrigleys of the world, to at least make the game look somewhat reminiscent of Major League Baseball. Once you've decided on a team to play as, you've got a few different game modes that you can experiment with. If you want to just play a simple game and take on either the computer or a second player, that's easy enough. But you can also either play a best-of-7 series against a team of your choosing, or attempt to defeat either every team in your division or the entire league one by one, with the latter game modes utilizing passwords to save your progress. If playing an entire game isn't what you want to do right then, you can also go into a fielding practice mode, a mode to look at each of the stadiums included in the game to see what Tengen customized and how close they might have gotten to the real thing, Home Run Derby mode, which is exactly what it sounds like, and finally Game Breakers mode, where you're given 17 different late game scenarios to try to conquer. I appreciate Tengen including all these game modes in the game, as it definitely gives you plenty of options for how you might want to play the game, but I really would have preferred to just have a normal full season mode. Sports Talk Baseball figured out how to do that over a year before, so there's really no excuse. Not to mention the fact that Tommy Lasorda's Baseball had an abbreviated season mode, and that game came out at launch. As far as gameplay goes, it's pretty consistent with other arcade baseball games of the time, where much of the game is presented in a batter-pitcher interface, with the camera up and behind the umpire. Pitchers could move back and forth on the rubber and then throw fastballs, breaking balls, or curves to the left and right, and batters can move around in the batter's box to try to position themselves to best make contact with the ball, given the proper timing. I don't really have any complaints about that, other than that maybe the game is a bit stingy with home runs, but where trouble can occur is when the ball is put into play. If you're playing defense, you may want to just go ahead and set the game to auto, which still requires you to throw the ball, because otherwise, it's going to be difficult to position your player correctly, as your player usually won't even be on screen until it's too late, and if you try to go with the middle defense setting, computer assisted, as soon as your player is shown on screen, they'll stop moving unless you're already holding down on the D-pad, usually allowing that split second necessary for the ball to go on by. I'm sure there are those that view the auto setting as cheating, and that's fine, but it's definitely the mode that I found the most enjoyable. Also, whether you're on offense or defense, for some reason the game plays ground balls very slowly, to the point to where there are far more infield hits than would normally occur. Not sure what's going on there, but it clearly could have used some tweaking. From a graphics and sound perspective, RBI Baseball 93 is definitely not up to the standards of what you would expect on a console in mid-1993, which is one of the problems with re-releasing essentially the same game that was already on the market 9 months previous. And honestly, it didn't even look or sound that good then. Sure, it's nice to have the customized outfield graphics for the different stadiums, and even fields where you can tell whether they're grass or turf depending on how it looks, but other than some uncharacteristically nice animation that's used when the pitcher throws the ball, there's not much here that's going to make you ooh and ah. The sound is similarly unimpressive, with probably its best feature being the music, which is admittedly not bad and does give a feel of an organist at a big league game. Just don't pay too much attention to the digital speech, especially since both Sports Talk Baseball and Hardball 3 had their own full announcers around the same time. If I had to describe RBI Baseball 93 in one word, it would be disappointing. And if I had to use two words, it would be cash grab. The game in and of itself isn't bad because it's exactly the same mediocre baseball game that RBI Baseball 4 was, literally. And if RBI Baseball 4 didn't exist, it would look much better in comparison, if perhaps a bit out of date with the times. But RBI Baseball 4 does exist, and because of that, I have to really question, why then does RBI Baseball 93 also exist? If there was no RBI Baseball 4, based on RBI Baseball 93's merits alone, I would give it the same rating that I gave to its two predecessors at 2 stars, because it's a decent baseball game that isn't anything special, and that also lives in a world that has both better and worse games available for the same console. But that's not reality. Reality is that Tengen released RBI Baseball 93 as a cheap cash grab to take advantage of fans wanting to play as Florida and Colorado. And because of that shameful low effort on Tengen's part, I'm giving RBI Baseball 93 only a single star. And if there's one thing that I don't do around here, it's reward companies for half-assed releases.
Okay, and that was RBI Baseball 93. I think I've spent more than enough time here complaining about how this game is the prototypical carbon copy sports game, and I've probably written more words here than anyone else ever has about this game. So I'm just going to wrap it up by saying, if you really want to play a baseball game from this time period on the Genesis, play Hardball 3 or perhaps Sports Talk Baseball if you want something that still has that arcade feel. But don't waste your time with this. Next time on Zilog and Moto, I mentioned it on last week's video that yes, there would be another sports game review coming up. I promise you, I don't hate my audience or success, but the goal of the channel is to review every game, and there just happens to be a lot of sports games in this catalog. And because I do hate myself, it just happens to be another Tengen game. But I can all but guarantee you that if you live in the United States, you are not going to be familiar with this one. At least this version anyway. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 205. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.